Hello, this is TelecomTV. I'm Martin Warwick. We are in Phoenix in Arizona, where it is sunny, but really not very hot, but then it is November. We're at ETSI NFV number 8 here in Arizona. I'm talking with Renu Navale, who is Senior Ecosystem Strategy Manager, Communication Storage and Infrastructure Group with Intel Corporation. Renu, good to see you again. Welcome.
Same here,
Let's begin with this. This is the end of phase 1 of NFV. It burst into the world from almost nowhere with obviously massive potential just 2 years ago. And now it has reached the end of phase 1. The ETSI NFV mandate has been extended by at least 2 further years, so there's a lot further to go with this. I'd like to begin by asking you, what do you think was achieved during phase 1 of NFV, and were your perceptions proven to be correct, and were your expectations met or even exceeded?
Okay, I'll actually start with the last question first.
Okay.
My expectations were widely exceeded. I think when ETSI started, it started with a group of industry leaders. They started to synergize on thought. They synergized on thought, addressed the challenges and opportunities in NFV, and they started to come together to convert that thought into specifications. As you know, we've had 235 members, 35 operators, I think over 9 documents, public documents up for consumption, 25 POCs. So I would say it's widely exceeded my expectations, and I think even the industry's expectations. I think they're starting to move into gathering momentum from into NFE.
Okay. What about any problems, any intractable problems that you think has been experienced in the group itself over that period of time? It would be remarkable if everything went perfectly over 2 years. I presume it didn't. Are any of those problems being carried over into phase 2?
So I personally am not part of any working groups, but I see the ramifications of the ETSI working group very closely in my role, because I work with the ecosystem, with the NFV ecosystem. And I think one of the problems that I'm seeing that I feel like ETSI should really address is the whole SDN versus NFV. Are they both required, software-defined networking and network function virtualization? Are they both going to happen at the same time? Is NFV going to happen before SDN? I've read a number of different articles about this, industry opinions from various ecosystem partners, and I think it would be really good for ETSI to address this. They are a bunch of industry leaders working together on specifications. It would be fantastic to have them address it more formally, in the form of their specification documents.
It seems from my reading of this and talking to people, Renu, is that there's been a lot of emphasis up to now on NFV, and obviously within the NFV group that's going to continue, but at the same time SDN has perhaps been the Cinderella in this, and it exists and it's there, but it's not been covered as much perhaps in the press and in study groups and so on as NFV has. And I think that may be part of it. Is that what you find?
That's exactly what I found. I've read separate articles on SDN. It's more prevalent in the data center and enterprise. You'll find that they actually recognize the word SDN way better than they do NFV, and I think it's the reverse with the telcos and service providers. But from an Intel perspective, we straddle both data center, enterprise, as well as telco and the networking infrastructure.
Indeed.
We see them both, and we really believe that they both are required. They both need to coexist, and I think it would be good to have the ETSI address it as well in terms of hey, what does this mean to orchestration, or what does this mean to some of the higher levels of policy control, and how are they both going to come together?
Do you have any lead on whether or not that's happening? Have you heard? Do you find that there is more emphasis now on SDN, and they are, because they're never going to join together, they are on parallel tracks, and parallel lines meet at infinity, but obviously one requires the other to coexist.
So from an Intel perspective, we actually have a division called SDND, which is SDN division. So we focus, I believe, equally on both from the communications infrastructure group. And I'd like to see the same thing mirrored within the ETSI, especially as they go into phase 2. Like to see them kind of address them both together.
Okay. So that's what you would like to see done. Is there anything else? I mean, over the end of phase 1 saw a lot of emphasis on proof of concepts, for example. I know that Intel have been involved in that. So can you speak to that and tell us what's happening as far as Intel is concerned?
So from an ecosystem as well as Intel's perspective, we're seeing the industry kind of coming together with various proofs of concepts for various NFV use cases. And I think some of those NFV use cases are, they're to some extent, I would say, point use cases. You know, what I'd like to see that evolve into is more end-to-end architecture or end-to-end use cases that will allow the operators and service providers to, you know, quickly take those blueprints into deployment. So I think we truly need to address the end-to-end aspect of the NFV and SDN architecture for all of this to be truly successful.
Two of the problems that I've been, challenges rather than problems, should we say, that I've been told about prior to this, and has been mentioned several times this morning, seem to be, first of all, interoperability, which is obviously going to be important for Intel and for other vendors, and also the fact that the standardization, which is so important to SDN and to NFV, isn't being compromised, but it's being made rather more complex because there are now such a number of standards bodies actually getting involved. So let's begin with interoperability. How, again, in Intel do you view that?
So I think, like I mentioned, the end-to-end architecture and specification is really critical for deployment. But as you start to break what's required for an end-to-end architecture, I think number one requirement for it all to come together is interoperability. And what does interoperability require is for the ecosystem, for all our industry leaders and Intel to start to work towards open platforms, open interfaces, open standards, open source. All of these things will start to come towards, you know, driving or making interoperability easier. We also had the OPNFE, which is the open platform for NFV, launch a month ago, and this I truly believe that launched because, number one, they needed to take the specifications into implementation. Number two, they needed to address the integration aspects of all these various pieces to come together to facilitate interoperability. I don't believe we're there yet, but OPNFE, the ETSI specifications and then OPNFE implementation is the kind of the precursor towards interoperability.
Now, OPNFE is going to produce open source code that will enable the realization of NFV solutions. You've talked about it. How do you see it advancing? It's a month since it was launched. Who's going to contribute to it and how? And do you think the feedback mechanism and loop is in place to enable that to go back into ETSI, to be operationalized, and then to come back out again and continue that feedback?
Sure. So ETSI, if you look at who the members of ETSI are and you start to look at who's part of OPNFE, you're going to see they're like Venn diagrams. There's a lot of the same folks. The same folks, as they were starting to create the specifications, realized that, hey, I need to find a way to take this into implementation. And at the same time, they realized they're all part of a community or a group, which means which is really what, you know, the open source community or Linux Foundation is kind of based on, is when a community start to work together, they start to share, they start to provide the feedback that's needed, you start to integrate the code, you start to upstream and downstream the code. All of that truly helps to integrate not only the community, but integrate the various components that's required for NFV interoperability and deployment. So I really believe that they're going to be you know, like two intersecting circles. You need the specs, but you also need the effort that goes into integrating all these pieces together.
I like the Venn diagram analogy. That works really well. I'll use that. Thank you. Thank you. Back to where we were. What about the other side of the coin, which I mentioned briefly before, is a number of, and you mentioned, the number of operators within the ETSI group. that must have quite an impact on the vendor community as well, because it's unique, I think, in terms of SDN and NFV, that there are so many operators represented from around the globe, and they're so powerful that their imprint is very, very much upon NFV. Is that causing difficulties for vendors such as Intel, or do you welcome it?
I believe we welcome it. I mean, if you look at our group or our division as well, I mean, Intel as a whole, we have very, very close relationships with all the service providers and operators. In all the global big service providers, we're working very closely with them. We have a close, trusted relationship with them, and I think we completely welcome their presence not only in ETSI but also in OPNFE.
A final question to you, Renu, is this. How important do you think Intel's involvement in ETSI ISG has been to date, and what role do you hope to play going forward into phase 2?
I think, you know, the importance of Intel in the ISG group, particularly of ETSI, has been that Intel was in a position to contribute a number of the building blocks that constitute kind of the foundation of what NFV can be built upon. You know, we have our processor technology, which allows for purpose-built hardware to move towards, you know, standard Intel architectural platforms. We have technologies like virtualization that can be enabled on our processors. That's again, you know, allowing network function virtualization to be based upon that. All of these things, we're making tremendous contributions to several open source standards, you know, OpenStack, Open Daylight, all of that. So all of these contributions, I think, are constituting kind of the foundation of the ISG specifications.
Okay. Renu Navali, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you, Martin.